All right, we've got a great topic for this episode. We're going to be talking about the Heaven's Gate religion, which was a UFO religion that existed primarily from the early 70s to the late 90s. They kind of came to notoriety in 1997 when 39 of their members committed suicide. This was and remains the largest mass suicide on US soil. Um, this is a group that I've spent a little over the last year studying pretty intensively. I've done a number of lectures about them on my channel. I've done interviews with people from this group. It's a group that I've come to empathize a lot with, and I would say it's a group that, while I don't subscribe to their beliefs myself, I would say that the time that I've spent studying them and speaking with these individuals has had a pretty profound impact on the way that I look at other belief systems.
Yeah, so my first impression is as I'm watching the documentaries, and I'm reading this essay by Robert Balch, I believe his name is. I'm getting the sense that they're one not as weird or crazy as I initially thought, and two that they are very similar to a lot of the topics that we've been talking about. And so like I like how you said that does doxastic lens, right? Like if we look at this in terms of what they believe and not necessarily like the power structure or the motivations that drove them there, then we might get some interesting and fruitful ideas about this, right? And maybe how it compares to other things in our society.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Why don't you tell us what like how they started first?
So the first thing I should point out, I guess, is that they weren't always called Heaven's Gate. That was a name that they took only in the last few years of their, main iteration. Um, the group that would later be known as Heaven's Gate was started sometime in the early 70s by a man named Marshall Applewhite and a woman named Bonnie Nettles. And the two of them met. The circumstances of their meeting is sort of debated, but the two of them probably met sometime around 1972. They sort of absconded together into the woods, hanging out in like the Pacific Northwest for a few years. They studied a lot of Eastern texts, Christian texts, the Bible. Um, Nettles was really interested in astrology and theosophy and other kind of new age elements. And at some point, it's not really clear when or how they arrived at this realization. But at some point in the early 70s, the two of them were reading the book of Revelation in the Bible, and they stumbled across, I believe it's in chapter 11, they stumbled across a verse concerning two witnesses. And these are two individuals that are supposed to come down in the end times, prophesy for 3.5 years, and then be executed. And then after being executed, they're going to rise from the dead and go up into heaven. And the identity of the two witnesses is sort of hotly debated. There's some theologians that think they might refer to Moses and Elijah, but there's other theories as to who it might have been. Applewhite and Nettles just decided that it was referring to them. They
Right.
determined that they must be these two witnesses.
I was wondering if we could maybe talk about this a little bit because I want to know before we get into like the membership part, like what do you feel? Do you feel like Nettles and Applewhite were like true believers of this system that they came up with?
Yeah, I do.
Right. That's the impression I was getting too. But I'm curious, like, do you like what level of commitment do you think they had to it? Because I know I sent you some of the theosophy stuff too. Like they had to be conscious that they're like kind of ripping some of the stuff off too in a way, right? Or like how would they view that?
Yeah. Okay, so a couple things there. I mean, the reason that I think they were true, the extent to which I think they were true believers, is basically that they undertook the same kind of practices that their followers undertook. Like Applewhite and Nettles renounced sex, they renounced alcohol, unhealthy eating, they lived monastic lives. They weren't making any money off of this. There wasn't any profit involved. Um, and these were the same kinds of regulations and restrictions that they, I don't even want to say imposed on the followers. I want to say they guided their followers to also participate in. I mean, maybe that sounds like a cop out, but I genuinely think that's a more accurate way of putting it because they were participating in these same regulations themselves. It's kind of like in the 12-step groups where you have like everyone in those groups is trying to abstain from alcohol or drugs. You know,
Hmm.
it's not like you go to these groups and you get a sponsor who's like, you know, getting drunk on the weekends. I mean, maybe that happens sometimes, but like, you know, the idea is that you're going through this process of growth and transformation with someone else who has been following that path for longer than you, someone you can look up to and try to emulate. That's kind of the way I would describe the relationship between the leaders and the followers, or they preferred the term students. That's how they would call their acolytes, the students.
Oh yeah, because I was just wondering, like with Mani, we're thinking about him and how he had like this calling, and he went out and tried to kind of find this higher self in a way.
Mhm.
So I was seeing some similarities with Applewhite with that. Like it feels like he had a similar kind of experience, although we know that he had like a mental breakdown. I don't know if Mani did, but
Yeah, well, as you had said, like they were kind of ripping things off and sort of how would they characterize it, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so the way that they look at, I think the way that they look at it is probably that the next level, meaning the race of extraterrestrials, it's kind of overseeing everything that goes on in the universe. Um, that they leave certain pieces of information behind in various religious systems.
Mm.
Um, while Heaven's Gate was clearly like a Christian group, although I guess maybe it's not so clear because I don't think a lot of people really know that. Um, but it very clearly was. But at the same time, they had this idea that that there's many ways to the top of the mountain, but ultimately the goal was to get off of the mountain. You know what I mean?
Do you think that would be similar to Schopenhauer or Buddhism as we were discussing it? Like that kind of getting off the mountain? Remember we talked about like there was the will is the problem. In one sense, we got to get out of the will completely. And then the other sense, it's like, no, the problem's us, not the will. So we don't have to remove the will completely. We just need to change our behavior.
Well, for them, the problem was being human.
Hmm.
Anything human was the problem. So I would say it's kind of both, right? Because it's the human body and the human will, the human minds, just anything related to this level of existence has got to go.
And then there's this belief in like the higher self in a sense, like Mani believed, like this kind of self, like because you gotta get rid of the human, but what's left over, right? What do you think? What would they say to that? Because I think my initial response, like from my belief system, would be like, "There's nothing else. We're just human. Like, what else could we look for?" But like then these some of these religions, it's like we have this other higher self. So like, what would they believe is that?
Well, they believe that the members of this higher kingdom that they're aspiring to become more like are compassionate. Um, they're more, you could call it more emotionally intelligent. I would say. They're better able to regulate their emotions. They're extremely efficient at everything that they do. Because what the next level is basically responsible for is running the universe, designing galaxies, designing planets, running experiments on planets, including Earth. They're very busy. Like when you get to the afterlife in Heaven's Gate, you're going to work. Like it's almost like a job, you know. Um, like I remember when met Sawyer and Kathy for the first time, I went to go watch them be interviewed by this guy, Professor Gladman. And one of the things that he observed, which I thought was really interesting, was he observed that kind of there's kind of a strain of bureaucracy in Heaven's Gate. And he wasn't saying it in like a negative way. He was just making an observation that the way they described the afterlife almost sounded like they were describing like a corporation, the way that it sort of functions. You know what I mean? So
Right.
I would say that this other self that they're aspiring to is a self that is free of all of the things that kind of bring us down, like attachments, strife, conflict, jealousy. These are emotions that next level beings don't have. They've gone beyond that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because I'm thinking, in one sense, it's almost like it's more metaphorical that we're going to the next level. But then I feel like I've seen a few quotes from like Nettles and Applewhite where they're like, no, we mean literally, physically, you're going to the next level. So that I'm like, it's a little interesting to interpret it because it's almost like I keep going back to Mani because I do think there's a similarity there where it's like materialism that he has with good and evil, where it's like you're literally getting rid of evil from your body in some sense, right?
Yeah. Well, I do you mind if I read the that Zeller quote that I sent you really quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So this is from Ben E. Zeller's Heaven's Gate, America's UFO Religion, where he talks about sort of the similarities between Manichaeism and Heaven's Gate. So he writes that adherents of the ancient and now mostly defunct Manichaean religion believed that Earth exists as a sort of battleground between good and evil, and that individual human lives serve as skirmishes in that battle. Like ancient Manichaeans, adherents of Heaven's Gate believed that while wholly good next level beings strived constantly to maintain a just and stable cosmos, periodically harvesting human souls to join them as the members of Heaven's Gate hoped to do, the universe was also filled with foul forces intent on destroying the next level's work, confusing human beings, and masquerading as gods. And
Right.
there, I guess he's referring to what Heaven's Gate believers call the lower forces. They're sort of the fallen angels that exist primarily to thwart the efforts of true believers to, attaining salvation, if you will.
Right. Um, Maybe I kind of want to read some of this theosophy, the Wikipedia, just real quick, just because there's a few things I noticed. I don't want to go super in depth with it though.
Uh-huh.
But this idea that humans have an ego or a monad that emanated from the solar deity, that they are composed of several parts, right? The
Hmm.
body, vitality, astral body, animal soul, human soul, spiritual soul, and spirit. This kind of separation of the human mind into different parts, separation of the body from the spirit, I feel like is similar to the Manichaeism and the Heaven's Gate. And then this idea that some of these components are immortal while others perish, and that the spiritual soul and spirit do not reside within the human body alongside the other components, but they're connected through the soul. So it's almost like this kind of idea of a vessel again. And
Yeah.
then the human soul's progress is to transition from the three halls, right? This transition from where we are to somewhere else, I think is a big component. The first was ignorance, which is the state of the soul before it understands. The second is the hall of learning, in which the individual becomes aware of other facets of life that they didn't know before, which I think is big in Heaven's Gate. And then the
Oh
third
yeah.
is wisdom, in which union with the higher self is made. And this idea of the higher self is like in all three of these kind of belief systems.
And yeah, I think that learning is, like you said, is a really big part of the Heaven's Gate sort of program.
Mhm.
This was something that like a lot of the people that died in 1997 had been with this group for like 20 years, working diligently on overcoming their humanness, as they put it.
Right. So maybe we can get into people joining now. Like what, because we were talking right before the show, like what what are the reasons why people join this cult? And I think both of us kind of came to the conclusion that it's really not what like the media kind of makes out to be.
Yeah, well, part of the issue that I have with the way that people typically talk about Heaven's Gate um is some people offer what might be good explanations for what keeps someone in the group, like these coercive tactics, brainwashing tactics, whatever, leaving aside the fact that there, as far as I'm aware, there is no consensus on what brainwashing actually even is or whether it exists.
Hmm.
Um, Leaving that aside, um, this is something that I've actually asked Zeller about maybe a few months ago. I asked him on Reddit what he makes of that sort of thing, and his answer I thought was really good. He says like a lot of these sort of like brainwashing and coercion narratives, they might explain what kept people in the group, but they don't account for what caused people to join in the first place. You know what I mean? And to
Yeah.
me, that's a big problem. That weakens the explanatory power of that theory, especially unless someone is being explicit and saying, "Look, I'm not trying to give an account for why people join these groups," but I think that is what people are doing usually when they talk about this. They talk about even the language that people use, like people have asked me like what kinds of recruitment tactics do Heaven's Gate believers use today, and I'm like, well, they don't call it recruitment tactics. They might call it carrying the message or spreading the word or something like that. You know what I mean? Like it's even the language that we choose to use, is can be, negative or neutral, I guess. And a lot of people tend to favor the more negative terms, I guess.
Well, looking at Balch's essay, I he did become a member essentially, right? But it seems like one, he emphasizes Bo and Peep emphasize the importance of free choice, right? So it doesn't seem like they were using any coercive tactics, at least to get people to join.
If
He's
anything, they would coerce people into leaving. I don't know if you picked up on any of that, but like one of the things that they would do is if you weren't like down with what they were about, like if you were smoking pot and having sex and drinking, and not practicing the things that you were supposed to be working on, they didn't want you there. Like they
right.
wanted to form a commune of people that were all kind of on the same page. And throughout their history, one of the things that they would do um is they would a lot of times they would give people money to leave. Like they would say, "We don't want you here anymore. Like if you don't want to be here, we don't want you to be here. Here's some money for a plane ticket or a bus fare, be on your way. If you change your mind, you can come back later, but don't come back until you're serious." Again, another parallel that I see with like 12-step groups, that's sort of the attitude of 12-step groups is what they call attraction rather than promotion. They're not the types of groups that are going to force someone to stay if they're not interested in what they're offering. Generally, I guess there might be exceptions, but
Right, and that seems different than some other cults, and I think maybe they get lumped together because I think there are some like that kind of go out and look for vulnerable people, especially in like drug communities or like mental health communities. But it seems like from what I've seen with Heaven's Gate, they were like more of just like a religion. They'd go out, they'd give their message, people would come to them, and they would try their best to like hide away, right? Like they were not, you would have to really seek them out if you wanted to join. And then the other thing is, I think there was a direct quote from Applewhite where he said, after a bunch of people left, you guys that remained made the first cut, right? Like they did not, you're like you said, they did not want people to stay.
Yeah,
Uh,
they really went through only two periods where they were on the road doing like proactive evangelizing. These were the first harvest of 1975 to 76, and then the second harvest, because they liked agricultural metaphors. Second harvest was 1994, I want to say.
mhm.
Um, Sometime in the 90s, they went out on the road again. But other than that, yeah, they pretty much kept to themselves. There's one guy who's still alive. His name's Carloti. He was I can't remember exactly when he joins the group, but I know he left in the 90s. He wasn't there for very long, but after he left, he talks about this in a documentary called The Day After. He talks about how he drove around like just randomly across the country, like looking for them, hoping he would find them before it was too late. This is like it's very surprising when you go into it with this idea of like this is a cult, right? And it's a cult because people call it a cult, and it gets lumped in with like these other groups that we call cults, because this is a word that doesn't really have any meaning other than these groups are like each other in some way or another that's sort of vague. There's something about these groups that is weird or scary or dangerous, so we give them this name. And you know it's it doesn't really clarify anything for me anyway about what the group believes or how they conducted themselves or what people were getting out of it.
I want to get into this a little bit. The people that joined, they were like Balch says they came from like two different demographic groups basically. The one was middle class, like kind of just middle class, like average people that led conventional lives, he says. And then the other was like college student, like hippie, basically, right? Like counterculture hippie-ish type people that were like in their earlier 20s. And he also says that most of them were free from commitment, and the ones that the media makes a big thing about, like, oh, they left their kids,
Yeah,
but
some did. Yeah.
he's saying like even the ones that did, they already had like a lot of them had already left their jobs, and it's like very overblown, like the amount of leaving the family that was happening. Like I said, for instance, a married couple reportedly gave away the farm after the Waldport meeting actually had sold their property and moved into a commune long before Bo and Peep entered the picture. Right.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering, one, what is making these people want to join the cult? Because we've talked about maybe some of the ideas, but like, why are the people attracted to it? And then two, what do you think the role the media has in like maybe exaggerating or misleading people into why people are actually doing this?
Well, I mean, it's also not just why did people join, but like, yeah, like why did joining this group terminate in so many extreme acts, like, and not just the suicides, but also like you said, like leaving behind children in some cases, like.
Well, I was thinking because Balch kind of makes it seem like it wasn't as extreme as people were making it out to be. Like most of them were kind of like didn't have a lot of attachments.
um I mean, it's hard to say too, because like Balch is talking about like a particular period in the group, like fairly early in the group's history, right?
Right.
Um, and I know that there is one woman whose both of her parents she lost. One
I
of them
saw.
was part of the 39, and then her father committed suicide, I think, a few months afterwards. Um, so she lost two parents, and she's talked about how like they basically sat her down one day and were like, you know, mommy and daddy have to go off on a UFO, so and there's no children allowed. That's
Yeah.
got to be rough. You know, I mean, I I feel like there needs to be a place for empathy for that sort of situation. And I mean, because like most, you know, if I go and join a Catholic church, you know, they're not going to tell me that you know, I'm not allowed to have children, or I'm not allowed to like talk to my family, or I have to leave behind my job or something like that. But this group did. Like,
Well, there is
and I think a lot of
convincing.
it is because the stakes were so high. Like baked into the belief system are some pretty high stakes. Like, first of all, the world is coming to an end. There is only one way off of this planet, and it's through us. So you kind of have to do what we say if you want to get off. If you want to stay, that's fine. But if you want to leave before the earth gets recycled, you got to do what we're doing. You know, those are some pretty high stakes, you know, and if someone is already bought into those, you know, more basic premises, like what these people are telling me is true, that could lead someone to justify a lot of pretty extreme behavior.
Well, I wonder though, and we kind of were getting into this because I was talking about how some of the stuff doesn't seem so detached from like normal things that we do in life call for. But then when you put it into this cult scenario, it seems absurd to people. So one,
Hmm.
I think people will leave their families, their friends, their entire lives behind to like go to college or like get a new job. So like to me, it's not so crazy that they're doing it for a cult. In fact, I think jobs demand a lot of people these days as far as like mobility and ability to cut ties from people, right? Maybe not to like the level of emotional investment, but I do think that like that's kind of become more of a requirement in our society, that kind of mobility. And two, I think I was talking about like the what was it, the 17, what was it called?
The 17 steps.
The 17 steps. Like if you look at it, a lot of these questions seem like things you would see on like a survey that you have to take before you go into a job, right? Like, are you a trustworthy person? Are you a slacker? Do you care about others? Like things like that. So then I'm like, well, I don't know how far how far removed this is from like maybe it's that the kind of organizations that we are part of are all kind of cults in a sense, and we just take it for granted that some are normal and some aren't, so to speak. Or is it that the idea that there is a cult that is separate from other institutions is just kind of a falsehood to begin with? What's your take on that?
I guess I want to be careful about going too far with the
Uh-huh.
like I don't want to go to one extreme or the other. Like I don't want to go to the extreme of trying to paint Heaven's Gate and all these other groups with this broad brush. Um
Right.
because I think there's a problem as soon as I even say that sentence, Heaven's Gate and all these other groups. What what are these all these other groups? Like why am I already beginning that sentence with the assumption that this group is part of a set of other groups when I haven't told you anything about this group or any of these other, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of like did you ever hear the ugly duckling theorem?
No.
It's basically this idea. I can't remember the name of the guy who came up with it, but it's basically an idea in like mathematics or set theory or something, where if you're trying to figure out what makes a duckling beautiful or ugly, and you want to say that it's some set of criteria. Like if you have three ducklings lined up in a row and you look at uh, two or three different characteristics, like color of their feathers or color of their beak or something like that. And you can line up all these ducklings next to each other and look at these characteristics. But at some point, because beauty and ugliness are not themselves empirical qualities, they're uh, combinations of criteria, you have to make an arbitrary move by assigning the label beauty or ugly to this criteria, to this set of characteristics, and not to the other set. You know what I mean? And I feel like I see a lot of that going on with the cult discourse, where you'll have certain criteria that people put forward, but then those criteria themselves are either lacking in clarity or lacking in rigor. Um, and at the end of the day, it seems like it's just this arbitrary step that we're making. I mean, I wish I had more. I mean, this is a topic that I think a lot about so much, but I've never actually sat down and tried to explain it because just the blowback that I will get, it just stresses me out too much and I just don't want to deal with it, you know?
I kind of want to. I want to go into it though, because I was thinking with the Roy Rappaport stuff we talked about, how like religion is kind of this initiation process that we use to kind of give authority to truth in statements, right? Like we can't really talk or have language without these ritual truth making processes. And I'm just thinking like maybe it's not so absurd to think, okay, we can think that Heaven's Gate is detrimental and that they go too far. That's fine. But maybe the difference is not in kind, but just in intensity, right? And that's I don't know why that
That's an interesting avenue to go down.
like
Yeah.
why should that be problematic to think about? Because I would say like there's just like I'm comparing it to businesses, but I or like corporate kind of culture nowadays. I would say like they give you room to be yourself to some degree, but you would be more yourself if you worked independently, right? If you're an independent contractor. So there's a difference in intensity to what they're demanding from you. And I think Heaven's Gate just demanded a lot from its members, probably too much for our moral sensibilities, right?
Well, it's that, but it's also the problem of like, let me present what I think people are trying to say when they say this group is a cult. I think there might be a lot of things that people are saying, but at minimum, I think what people are trying to express is that this group is a cult because it somehow limits people's freedom to an unacceptable degree.
Yes. Go ahead.
Because I think most people believe, unless you're like, I guess, an anarchist, um, I think most people believe that there is such a thing as an acceptable degree of limitations on freedom. Like we place limitations on people's freedom to go out and murder people. Like you're not free to go do that. You'll be punished if you do that,
You have
you
to
know?
work for 8 hours a day, whether you like it or not, for most people, right?
Yeah. But the question is like, what is an acceptable and an unacceptable limitation on someone's freedom, especially when someone is actively seeking out to have their freedom limited. Like one of the things that Sawyer talked to me about when I met him last December was, I think, really difficult for me to wrap my head around because it was so antithetical to like the assumptions that the kind of preconceived ideas that I had about this group going into it, like most people do, which is, this is like a hive mind sort of thing. One of the things that he told me was that when you would when you would pair people up together in this group, they had this system of partners called check partners, where you were sort of like accountable to each other. One of the things that he said was that unless someone explicitly asked for your opinion or your feedback, you weren't allowed to give it to them. Like there had to be this volunteering of like, I'm consenting to have you correct my behavior. And just the decision on someone's part to join a group where you're going to be celibate, you're going to be, you know, uh, living this monastic life. Like this is like Heaven's Gate is not it's not surprising to me that it had like virtually no mass appeal because it doesn't stroke your ego at all, you know? Like
Yeah,
it's not like these like MLM kind of things, you know, or like I don't know, like it's not surprising to me that they had a hard time getting people to join them because
well,
what they were selling was not they were selling the straight and narrow path, the hardest biggest pill to swallow, you know?
I did want to bring up just the one other thing while we're talking about them getting members, because remember I was talking about like the Iron Cage and kind of the Weberian view of religion.
Yeah, yeah, go into that.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering because one thing I'm noticing is that a lot of these people that seem to be joining based on the documentary I watched and this paper is that they were like sick of their lives in some way. But I'm also wondering, like, if we do view our mundane life in the world as its own kind of order and system of beliefs, and they're trying to leave for another one, well, what is the origin of those beliefs? And is it just that they're exchanging one system for another? Is that system like grounded in religion in some way? And I think Weber kind of has an interesting idea. So he says that there's this process of rationalization in society. So it's like we're taking these kind of religious beliefs that start from like a more like personal, I think he calls it like the charismatic leadership, where you're like directly influenced by the person or the thing that you are believing in. And there's a process of rationalization where these beliefs become reified into real life, right? Because they are somewhat inconsistent with the world that people experience. So he talks about like a belief in gods tends to become more universal so that it is less likely to be disproven, right? Because this idea of a personal God is going to eventually be subject to scrutiny in the natural world in some way. So this process of rationalization makes the beliefs more ordered into the society. And then he thinks ultimately we get to this point where they become so rationalized that they almost become what he calls the iron cage. So he says the Puritan wanted to work in a calling and we are forced to do so, right? So there's this idea that they volunteer to work originally, but now we're forced to do what was originally volunteered to do, right? And I think that has some overlap with what we were talking about with Heaven's Gate. And then he says, for when aestheticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of modern economic order. So that's why I'm also saying, like, Weber in 1904 is already saying that our modern kind of sensibility and work ethic is structured in this asceticism that came out of religion. So I don't think it's a huge leap to compare Heaven's Gate to that with it either, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost like, you know, because it's so are you saying that like from Weber's point of view, like society, like even so-called secular society is actually quite ascetic in some way, with like the self-denial and denying instant gratification and that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, I think he thinks that, well, at least our modern society evolved from this Protestant work ethic, and people have different takes on that. It's a little controversial, but I do think that he's right to point out that we don't just go from the state of being religious to being secular, like
Hmm.
those kind of modes of truth making are still, they just transition over to from the religious order to the bureaucratic order, right? Like I do think that is true. It's just to what extent is it directly derived from the religion? But then I'm thinking, well, these particular individuals, they are trying to reject this one kind of mundane monasticism in order to have one that they feel like maybe they have more control over.
I mean, I feel like for these individuals, the truth of their beliefs was sort of proven kind of pragmatically. Like a lot of the teachings that they were given were specific ways of thinking, specific ways of handling emotions, specific ways of conducting themselves. And I think over time, the people that stayed with the group for years did so because they found that their lives were somehow improved by following these procedures, as they called them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going off of the Balch essay right now. Like, what he quoted one person saying, "I could get high so many ways, drugs, music, scenery, people, but I still felt an emptiness. I never felt that fullness, that rock bottom solidness I was looking for."
Yeah, and I feel like that isn't unique to Heaven's Gate at all, that people are feeling that way before they come into contact with this group. I mean, that's how people feel before they, get to like AA or something. They hit rock bottom, right? But for
Mhm.
some reason it's treated as this negative thing, like, oh, they were taking advantage of people who felt like they were missing something in their lives. And it's like, okay, who doesn't feel like they're missing something in their lives? That's literally everyone. It's the human condition. This is just the way that these people went about dealing with it.
No, but see, I think here, and I think you might even disagree with what you just said yourself, because we talk about how meanings discourse is kind of this new thing. And I'm wondering, maybe that's not the condition of human life. Maybe this is something imposed on us by the state that we live in. Because, like,
Mm.
these cults had a heyday in like the 70s, and I wonder if there's a reason why they did.
There might be something to that.
Just
Yeah.
listen to this other thing Weber says. He says rationalization destroyed the authority of magic power, but it also brought into being machine-like regulation of bureaucracy, which ultimately challenges all systems of belief. So I feel like it's more like not so much that our natural condition is searching for belief, but that bureaucracy, or maybe something related to that, our modern society has just destroyed all the other systems of belief.
I mean, I I I don't know how I feel about that, because I mean, in general, I don't know how I feel about Weber's analysis of history and religion in general.
Totally, yeah. No, I'm just throwing it
Um,
out as like just something to think about.
yeah, well, I mean, maybe I don't have a particular argument for it. It's
Mhm.
just a starting point for me, as I kind of think that people have always had a problem regulating their desires, and that regulating our desires can be a good thing, whether we're living in a capitalist society or not, whether we're living in modern times or not. I think that if we just do what we feel like all the time, I don't know how good of a life that's actually going to be.
Well, I'm wondering though, because it gets tied to meaning, the meanings discourse too, though, right?
Well, I guess I mean, when I said human condition, I don't think I have meaning of life in mind there. I think I mean something that is true just by virtue of us being human, I guess.
Well, I'm just
Which
wondering.
could which we could tack on any number of contingent statements to that. Like there's something that is true of being human in this particular age that maybe wasn't true of humans in
Mm,
hunter-gatherer societies or something.
yeah, no, yeah, I agree with that. I'm wondering because this girl says I felt still felt empty, the rock bottom solidness I was looking for. That to me is like a meanings discourse, right? This is just one person too. Like I don't want to say this is
Right.
all people, but
I get maybe it's just a semantic thing, I guess, because from I'm and I don't know why, but I guess the idea of meaning doesn't really even enter my mind when I hear someone talking about emptiness. Because I don't know that I believe that the meaning discourse provides a sense of fullness. I
no,
actually
I
think
agree
it
with
is quite a
that.
hollowing out philosophy.
I would love for us to do an episode on that because I think we're very much in agreement on that. But I kind of think that this, from my view, and why I was a little attracted to the Weber quote, even though I agree with you, it's like his analysis of history is a little controversial, right? But is I do think that means discourse did arise at a certain point, and there's
Hmm.
a reason why it arose at that point. And I think that a lot of the philosophy that people are into nowadays kind of stems from it, like the existentialist kind of stuff. And I also wonder if this kind of like hippie searching for meaning, searching for like the right scene is also a symptom of that in another way. This kind of, well, um, Balch quotes Robert Lifton, who talks about the protean man, the self process of an interminable series of experiments and explorations, some shallow, some profound, each of which may readily be abandoned in favor of still new psychological quests. Like that's like the hollowed outness of this kind of meanings discourse that I think of, right? Just constantly searching for a thing to validate yourself.
Well, I guess maybe that's where I'm coming at it from a different perspective. Like I'm coming at it from I mean, I am someone that can relate to the search for spiritual what have you. Like that's been a part of my life for most of my life. I've always been, you know, I've always been religious of some sort or another. And
Right.
um as I got older, and started exploring other ideas, other practices, other belief systems, like that became kind of normal, like for me. And I was also, for most of my 20s, I was around a lot of other people that were also kind of trying out different things and taking sort of I guess you could call an eclectic path, where we're looking for what works, whether it comes from Christianity or Hinduism or astrology, whatever it is, Heaven's Gate, whatever it happens to be, does it do something? Does it give me a feeling of connection to something? Does it improve my life? Does it make me a better person? Does it make me happier? Does it do something? You know, and then whether or not it's true sort of becomes not a very interesting question if it's working, I guess. And I think I think that's sort of that's something I think I need to be more aware of too when I study groups like Heaven's Gate, is I'm bringing a lot of that into it, where I'm looking at it, I'm like, yeah, this is totally normal. One year you're into astrology, then the next year you're into Buddhism, and then the next year you're into UFOs and stuff. That to me is normal. Like that doesn't raise red flags to me at all because I've done it, and a lot of the people that I'm friends with, are seekers, but maybe that's something I need to be more aware of. Maybe that somehow colors my interpretation of this stuff. I don't know.